Hello, and thank you for joining me for another oil painting demonstration. In this video I'm going to be painting a horse and rider, which would be termed an equestrian portrait, and this is being painted on a 16 by 20 hardboard panel that's been primed with gesso and then toned with a thin wash of burnt umber, and I'm using a thin burnt umber to outline the lines here of the dynamic symmetry grid, which I explained in previous videos the importance of that and how it's used for composing an image. And these marks that you see me making are done with a set of calipers held at a distance to help find those points on the grid. And the main purpose of that is purely for composition's sake and just to help recognize where the golden ratio lines up on the surface. And you can see that I'm using that same thin wash of burnt umber to sketch in the form of the horse, and this is done at a time-lapse speed of about 3 times from a 2-hour video. And when you're painting on your own, take your time with it, and there are alternative ways to block in the forms like this. For me, I'm not an expert in horse anatomy by any stretch of the imagination, and the way I learned to paint horses was to think of them in terms of human anatomy, which I do understand a bit better because I am ostensibly a human. And the legs of the horse can be thought of in the same proportionality as the limbs of a person, with the hoof part. It's sort of like the hand. The hoof is the tips of the fingers, I think. It's a bit complicated, but that's something that comes with just practicing and observing. But if you want to skip all of that, you can always use a traditional square grid, like a 1-inch grid, and copy over an image from a photograph or something like that. And a lot of painters now will use an iPad that's the same dimensions as what they're painting, especially if you're working like a watercolor or something like that, and then you can just effectively copy what you're seeing. So whenever I'm drawing like this, I try to find the angles with the brush against the reference photo. So I would compare, for example, the head of the horse, the head of the rider to the rump of the horse. I'm not sure what that's called, the withers or the flanks or whatever. And you find that angle and then compare that angle to the withers of the horse to the shank or the front leg, and so on and so forth. But this stage is effectively like drawing, and a lot of painters will actually draw with graphite or charcoal or pencil and be really meticulous in that approach. And if you're trying to paint more like academic realism, then that's necessary. But for me, I try to paint more pragmatically in a sort of impressionism, or some intermediary between realism and impressionism. Gestural realism, I guess. And to me, that's what elevates painting above illustration, when you're trying to impart some sense of movement and your interpretation of the forms and motion and the essence, the gestalt of the image, beyond simply making a facsimile of a thing. Because especially in these days of AI image generation, it's important for painters to look for a way to elevate an image beyond simply copying a thing. And that's the role of an artist, is to try to depict the superlative of what a thing can be. So at this stage, there's just a lot of refinement that goes on, where you'll block in the form and then you sort of check your work. And for me, I think I've mentioned this in a previous video. I take a small mirror about 2 inches high, and I hold it up to my left eye and turn around and look at the painting in the mirror, and that helps to recognize mistakes that we might otherwise miss. And that's effectively what you're doing in this first half hour, 15 minutes to half an hour. You're just blocking in color and looking for mistakes and trying to correct the mistakes as you go. And a lot of painters and a lot of art instructors will talk about squinting the eyes and trying to paint large gestural portions of the image. And that's what you would be doing at this stage. Instead of, and it's easy to get, especially for me, because I tend to have a fastidious approach to everything. I will fixate on something and be, and sort of overthink, am I painting the knee of the horse accurately? And then I'll get stuck on painting the knee of the horse and worry about the highlights and the shadows on the knee. And that needs to be postponed until you've established the base colors of everything, or the body tone or the mass tone. And this is something for me that's unique to oil painting that I've not observed as much with the time that I've worked in acrylics and watercolor and gouache. With oil painting, there's an oxidation that occurs between the time you lay the first layer of paint on, and as it begins to oxidize, not to dry but to oxidize. And usually you can get the best color if you lay down that base coat and then give it a little bit of time and return and increase the highlights and the shadows. So for this first layer, we're trying to aim for what's called the mass tone or the body tone, and that's where you sort of squint your eyes and ignore the brightest and the darkest colors and just try to paint in those the median range of what you're seeing. So like the whites of the feet and the pants of the rider are painted in a gray, and I made that gray with burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And in some of my other videos, I included the palette beside so you could see the process of how I mix the colors, but you can return back to those videos for your reference if needed. But suffice it to say that I mix colors on the palette as I go. And to make a gray, I would mix burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. And you can warm that gray mixture or cool it. And then for the grass color here, I'm using, I think it's called light green or permanent green light, but there are all sorts of formulas you could use to make a similar green. And of course for the body of the horse, I'm using burnt umber with burnt sienna and yellow ochre, depending on if I'm trying to warm it or cool it. And you can use that same gray mixture for the shadowed parts of the horse. And the green of the grass is serving as an outline too, which I know I mentioned in previous videos, but the importance of outlining a form using a neutral dark color, because you're not going to have hard lines for the outline, but you want a sort of gradient effect. And that's something you just really have to practice and get a feel for, because when I was learning to paint, I understood this rule that you never paint hard edges or hard lines, and that's certainly not a rule. It's something that's often broken. Like when I was learning to paint, I was told that you should always, if you're painting a straight line, like seeing the leg of the horse as a straight line, that you should paint that with horizontal brush marks rather than one vertical brush mark for the leg of the horse. And while that may be true and helpful in a general sense, it's not something that you should allow yourself to really consider axiomatic. It's something that's is a guide, but there are always variations and times when that's not true. And for me, when I'm painting a tree trunk or the leg of a horse or a vertical line, I paint it as a vertical line, and then I go in later, which is why I was talking about that secondary layer after the paint has begun to oxidize. And that's the point at which you can think more in terms of painting with the flow of the geometry of the thing. And here again with the grass, I'm using a dark, warm tone for the actual shadow beneath the horse, and then a cooler, light highlight for the grass in the background. And the reference photo that I was working from had a fairly complicated scene of an equestrian, I don't know what they call the steeplechase fences and whatnot, were in the background. And instead of trying to reproduce that accurately, I chose to just sort of abstract it a bit, use it for the geometry of it, and for the purpose of silhouetting the head of the horse, but not, worrying about having too much detail in the architecture of the fences, because that would be a distraction. But it does serve an effective purpose in contrast with the dark of the horse. So I kept it in the background for that reason. And you can see that the line of the fence will line up fairly closely with that 1.618 golden ratio segment at the top. And of course, the rider herself is going to be almost perfectly centered, but above at one of those armature positions. And that's a technique that's common in classical portraiture, because it's not so much that the rule is not that the focal point can't be in the center. It shouldn't be dead center necessarily, but it's fine for it to be centered above or below or to one side or the other. It can be centered on one axis, either the X or the Y, but it shouldn't be centered on both. And the importance of that armature or the dynamic symmetry grid is rather that you want to have like a serpentine curve, or you want to have the geometry is for the eye to follow the parts of the image. So in this case, you would look at the face of the rider and then down through the hands and on to the feet of the horse, and then maybe back up again. And that sort of thing is to keep the interest of the viewer going through the painting. And for the foliage in the distance, I use a gray-green. So I'm using that burnt umber, ultramarine blue, titanium white, and mixing that in with a green color, because that will serve to establish the distance and to play that desaturated tone against the richer tone of the rider and the horse in the foreground. And again, when you're working at this stage of the painting, you want to use a good proportion of paint thinner, which follows the rule of fat over lean. And that actual rule is often misunderstood, and I was taught it erroneously, as far as I understand. And as you see, the sky here is being painted with phthalo blue, titanium white, and ultramarine blue to sort of tone down the phthalo, because phthalo blue is a very, very strong color, as Bob Ross often rightly said, and it's good to tone it down a bit with either a warm earth tone like a burnt umber or burnt sienna, or with ultramarine blue. If you use the earth tones, you have to be very sparing with them, because they will be almost as powerful as the phthalo color. So you're using mostly titanium white for that sky color. And I lost my train of thought, which is, I suppose, part of these off-the-cuff narrations. And if you enjoy these videos, be sure to like, share, subscribe, go on my website and sign up for my newsletter. I would like to do live streams at some point in the future where I can narrate over a video as it's going live, but that will necessitate a bit more following than I have right now, and the gumption to do so, because even doing this, my cat does not like to be left alone for very long. So I try to do these narrations as quickly as I can. And you can see that I'm using that sky color to again outline the form of the rider. And that's where you get the dynamism of the focal point of a painting, which is the most important thing, is that strength of contrast between light and dark and between saturated and desaturated. So the form of the rider is going to be very saturated and very dark, and that will bring it more to the foreground, and then the background is going to be desaturated and light. And there's a pitfall that often ensnares amateur painters, which got me when I was learning to paint, in that it's easy to mistakenly think that the sky is the lightest in value, and it's really not. If you look at a lot of like black and white photography, you can get a sense of this. The sky is a light value, but it's always a bit gray or a bit darker than the brightest highlights on the subject or in the foreground. And that's something that you just have to become accustomed to through observation and through practice. And you'll have to forgive these pauses in the video. I think I had gone to change the music or something that was going on in the background. And I mention often in my other videos the importance of thoroughly cleaning your brushes between applications of paint. You can see that I hold about a half dozen or so brushes, and I'll use different ones for different colors. I'll usually have a few for cool colors, a few for warm colors, and ones for the highlights, ones for the shadows, and that sort of thing. But when you're learning to paint and you only have a few brushes, then you have to use what you have, and it's very important to thoroughly wash or clean the brush with paint thinner and then dry it with a paper towel so that you're not adulterating the colors with whatever previous color you'd worked with. And that's especially true with if you're working like from the sky blue and then trying to paint the warmth of the horse, and everything can really get muddy by doing that. And of course, that's not to say that there aren't occasions when mud is a good thing, but just be mindful of what you're doing, and do so volitionally and not haphazardly or accidentally. And you can see those sort of purple colors that I use for the clouds there. This video was recorded a while back, and I've actually learned subsequent to painting this the importance of using warm colors in the shadows of the clouds. But I'll go into that in another video maybe. But this was a bit of a learning experience for me too. And I've always used cadmium red or a synthetic substitute for cadmium red for the highlights of clouds, and doing the blue wash beforehand, it allows some of that blue color to go into and seep into the red, which I've seen a lot of painters on YouTube and in books that have mentioned using yellows in clouds, and I do see yellow in clouds in life, but the only time I use yellow with the sky is right along the horizon. I'll sometimes use a Naples yellow, which is a cool yellow, and even with that you have to be careful and use like reds around it. So you can use like a sienna or an umber in a very gray warm color, and then you can have that yellow, but it's something that you really have to plan for. Whereas if you're painting a quick sky like this that's sort of an afterthought, or it's secondary and is just a supporting role to the horse, then you don't want to have to put all that extra effort and attention into the sky. So the simplest and most effective formula that I've found is to use that cadmium red light, because it makes a nice warm pink, and that color blends really nicely with the blue of the sky without having to worry about any weirdness that might occur from yellows or too much mud colors from the sky. Because when the cadmium red and the ultramarine or phthalo blue mix, they actually make a nice lavender color, as Bob Ross called it. And that's the color that you want for the boundary between the clouds and the sky, or between the layers of the billows of the clouds, which is quite a nice sort of poetic sounding term. But you can see I'm continuing to define the form of the horse. And as I was saying, I'm not an expert in horse anatomy, so there's just a lot of observation, a lot of guesswork, and I approach a horse the same way I would approach a still life, and with some cursory knowledge of the anatomy, but for the most part I'm just sort of looking at the shapes and the forms and painting them accordingly, with the highlights in the sunlit areas painted in a warm, well, let me get there. It's a bit obtuse, but the sunlit areas in direct sunlight, the highlights, the very brightest specular reflections, are going to be painted in a cool color. The mass tone in the sunlit areas are going to be painted in a warm color, and the shadows of the sunlit area are going to be painted in a cool color. And then that value range of the shadows of the warmest sunlit parts will represent the highlight, if that's the right term, for the shadowed part. And that's why there's this gradient. So the darkest of the lights become the lightest of the darks in the shadows, and then the darkest shadows I paint usually in a cool color, which goes against what the eminent art expert Stefan Ballmann suggests, to always use warms in the shadows and cools in the highlights. And I do use warm for like black or the true darkest darks of the shadows, but for what I would call the mass tone, body tone of the shadowed portions, I use cool colors, meaning like phthalo blue, alizarin crimson, raw umber, and so on and so forth. But you can see I'm beginning to establish where some of those highlights will be on the horse. And one thing that seems to be unique, or somewhat unique to my painting style, that I don't see in galleries and people who paint the type of imagery that I paint, I tend to paint more thickly than a lot of academic realist painters do. A lot of them will work in several layers, and they'll allow one layer to dry, and then they'll oil out the painting with linseed oil and a sort of a medium, whereas I don't really use medium on most paintings. If it's something really large and complicated, I will, but for something like this size, I try to paint everything in one sitting, and sitting or standing, however it be. But I try to apply the paint all sort of alla prima, and when doing that, you have to build the paint up thick, especially to get the brightest highlights. Unless, of course, I suppose if you planned it out and you had a white surface underneath, then you could paint more like a watercolor and use thinner paints, but that's not the style I paint in. And as I've said before, I'm more of a painter than I am a teacher, and what works for me is not necessarily the most intuitive or the most pragmatic approach, and I would not recommend trying to paint like me, because I think that we all have our own ways of understanding things and our own ways of processing imagery, and it's important that artists not rely on trying to imitate anyone. And that's why I don't really watch tutorials anymore, and I did when I was first learning to paint. And in fact, I've really not watched much except Bob Ross and Helen Van Wyck. I learned a lot from Helen Van Wyck, and every now and then, just through being on social media and being in the arts, I'm often met with some sort of advice or another, or I'll see some painters complaining or explaining something, and I'll pick up information like that here and there, but I don't really seek it out. And I've always felt the same way about music. I've never tried to imitate anyone else's style. I've never tried to memorize passages of music to play like someone else. I just do my best to approach it spontaneously and sincerely. And I think that painting should be that way too. And of course, I think a lot of people just enjoy watching painting demonstrations, and it can be kind of calming. Apparently Bob Ross's stock in trade was that people would listen to him when they went to sleep. And if I get enough of a following, I reckon I can start doing sort of a southern accent and be a little more folksy with things and beat the devil out of it, or whatever we need to do. But I thought it was funny. Bob Ross, I remember hearing him say that he talked to the audience like they were his lover, and I thought that was funny. And like I said, if I get enough of a following, and if the money's right, I'll do whatever we need to do. We can have ASMR painting sessions. You can see I'm continuing to darken the forelocks of the horse there. Fetlocks, forelocks, whatever they're called. And using more of that gray mixture. That cool gray really works nicely for the highlights in the areas that are not directly lit, or if you're painting an overcast, which I think, if I remember right, this painting, the reference photo was sort of an overcast day, so you did get the cast shadow on the ground, but it was not that strong. And so for overcast conditions, you're going to paint as though there is no sunlit direct light, and everything is in that sort of shadowed range of tones, with the highlights being warm, the mass tone being cool. And for that cool color is where you'll get that sort of blue-gray, and then using the warm color, what I would call the actual color, like if you were to view the horse in perfect lighting, it would be that russet brown color. And that's the color, if you look at the drawings of children or the drawings of amateur painters, like when we're learning to paint and you say, you know, what color is this horse? Well, the horse is brown, and that's the mass tone or the body tone. And then that will be the majority of the color. That's the color that you would see if you sort of blurred your vision. And then those highlights are going to be that gray, that bluish gray color. And then the shadowed range will be a warmer mix of burnt umber or ultramarine blue. And a color that I've been using for the past year or so is Van Dyck brown, and it's not included in a lot of art textbooks, and I don't hear a lot of artists really talk about it much. And it's an odd color because it's technically warm. I use it as though it were a cool color because I think it is a bit cooler than burnt umber, and it's a bit darker than burnt umber, but it's transparent. And that's the reason I use it, is because it's very useful to have a transparent brown. And you know, it helps to unify colors together. And if you mix that Van Dyck brown with ultramarine blue, which is also a transparent color, you can get some really nice sort of wash effects even when you're working alla prima like this. So especially for darks, I like to use that mixture of the Van Dyke brown and ultramarine blue instead of my usual mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. The burnt umber is really good when you need an opaque black or like a really, really dark area. But for the intermediate range of dark transitioning into a lit region, is better to use the Van Dyke brown. And it blends well with burnt umber, and it's easy to sort of mix the two together. And when you're painting something like this, we're getting at the halfway mark, about 30 minutes into the video, and this is where you can start putting all the details in, and as much or as little detail as you want. The more I paint, the more I try to not worry so much about details, because some of the best and most effective paintings really don't have much detail. They have the impression of detail, which is what Impressionism is. And it's most effective when it imitates the process of the human optical condition, where when we see something, the eye focuses on a very small area about the size of a quarter. If you held a $quarter at arm's length, that's about the size that our vision can really process, and that's what the highlight or the focal point represents, that sharpness or that area of refinement. And that's where you want to have the most detail, the most actual, meticulous rendering. You have to excuse my cat meowing in the background. So for this painting, the rider, the hands, and the face of the rider are the area that are really in the focal resolution. And everything outside of that, we want it to become gradually less detailed so as not to distract from the subject. So like when you're painting all the reins and the accoutrement of the horse, it's more effective, and this is counterintuitive. You would think that the more detail you put in, the better. But I find that they read more accurately, they read more natural if you use a bigger brush, broader gestures, broader brush marks, instead of going in and really trying to paint every little turn of the lead, or whatever the reins are called. I should learn all of this terminology because I've painted so many horses, and I know just from having painted them and looked at the photos what all these different reins are that go into the bit, but I don't know the names of any of them. And this portion of the video was taken, I think, later the same evening, but it had given the paint a bit of time to oxidize, or some people call it tacking up. But you can see how the colors are a bit more muted, and that allows us to go in and add more of the highlights. So on the boots, I'm using that very light blue-gray for the highlights. And with the warm, sort of ruddy colored leather, I use a alizarin crimson, because you want to use like a red on red. And you can even, if you're trying to have like a really brilliant highlight, you can use the complement, which would be green, and you could use like a lime green with titanium white. But that would be more if you're painting, like, say, a soda bottle, like a glass bottle that's got an actual perfect reflection of the sunlight, whereas leather is usually rough enough that you don't get that what's called specularity. It probably has like a 40% specularity rather than like 80% that you would get on glass. And that's the way that you can determine how to paint various fabrics and textures, and it comes from observation, understanding the materials themselves, and that sort of thing. But a lot of that you can just observe from a photograph. Say if you were painting a material that you weren't familiar with, you can just look at the photo and see, and try to match the colors that you see. And a lot of great painters have always said that it's important to just paint what you see without regard for any sort of formula. And that's another reason that I try to avoid following any sort of formulas or painting tutorials, because I want to approach each painting dynamically and react to what I see, rather than trying to place a label onto a thing. And there's a great philosophical message in all of that, in approaching everything spontaneously. I think it's Lao Tzu, or one of the Chinese philosophers, said that it's very important to approach every situation as though it were a novel one, and not something that we're accustomed to. And you can see here I'm continuing to form the jacket of the rider, and I'm using a fairly large brush there. You can see I'm shortly after I painted this, I finally gave in and purchased some new brushes, but I was still using some very old frayed brushes. And there are pros and cons to that. If you have the budget to buy good brushes, I would recommend just buying good brushes. But if you don't have the budget for good brushes, it's a learning experience, and you can make do with pretty much any kind of materials. It's just easier. The better quality the materials are, the easier it is. And ease does not always translate into merit with painting. And one thing I would really say is that you shouldn't compromise on the quality of the paints you buy, and try to at least buy student brand paints from a reputable brand like Winsor & Newton or Utrecht. And they're fairly affordable. Like a small tube of paint from them is $4 or $5. If you get anything cheaper from Hobby Lobby, in particular Hobby Lobby paints and their brushes are all absolute garbage, and they are manufactured in China, and they have just like the pigment to binder ratio is absurd, and they turn chalky, they are inconsistent from tube to tube, and I could complain for a long time. We could do a whole rant video. I'll get in my pickup truck and put on a hat and just complain about the quality of paint from Hobby Lobby. But I would just strongly recommend that you flee from anything to do with Hobby Lobby paints, because they are such a chore to work with, and I struggle to use them at all. And if I were learning to paint and were trying to use that kind of paint, I think I would have given up. And I was fortunate to have started with Winsor & Newton or Winton paints. And I remember when I was learning to paint and thinking how expensive the paint was, and I didn't use very much of it because it was so expensive. But with better quality paint like that, you can use less and have much better results than using much greater volume of the cheap paint. But one thing that you will notice as you paint is that the thicker the paint application is, or the more paint you load the brush with, the easier it is to really get the color that you're aiming for, and the easier it is to blend the colors when you're working alla prima like this. If you are on a real budgetary constraint and you have the time to do so, you can paint in layers. You can let one layer of oils dry, and if you paint with paint thinner, it will dry to the touch within 24 hours, and the next day you can come and use a medium with linseed oil and paint thinner, and then paint thinly over that, and then maybe do a third layer subsequent to it, and use much less paint. But you're trading off because you have to spend more time. So you have to determine what's more valuable to you, your time or your paint investment. And you can see I'm just continuing to piddle with some of the details on like the boots. And it's always important to think about the outline of the subject, and that's something that I had to be taught. I had another artist tell me, look at your outlines, and I wasn't really thinking that much in those terms. A friend of mine is always talking about comic art and line art and the importance of line weight. So the leading edge, or the edge coming towards you in a comic book, is going to have thicker line work, and then the parts that are away from you or that are less defined are painted with thinner lines. And you don't necessarily observe that in traditional painting, but the concept holds in what I was describing with the degree of detail and how you want more detail in the foreground and more vague in the background. And likewise with the juxtaposition of saturated color, muted color, and with hard and soft edges, or lost and found edges as they're called. So like the tail of the horse here, you can see I haven't done much with it, and that would be a lost edge. And you kind of keep everything, like the brushwork should remain visible, and there's no attempt to have any sharp lines. And then the found edges would be like the head of the horse and the part that's leading towards the viewer. And that can really create that sense of dynamism and that sense of motion. Like if you look at some of the old cartoons, like Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny, and that kind of thing, they'll have actual lines showing movement, like trailing behind, like when the Roadrunner would leave, or when Wile E. Coyote would flee from the Roadrunner, there would be a poof, like a cloud, and that's literally having a cloud of motion behind you. And with quote-unquote fine art painting like this, you're still depicting that poof of smoke behind the object by leaving the shadowed portions or the receding portions more vague and with less defined lines. And the same goes for the distant tree line. Something that I've only just begun to really understand is the importance of having the canopy of trees in the distance should incorporate some of the sky color into the top of the boughs, because I always learned this rule that when you're painting anything, it's going to be lighter at the bottom and darker at the top because of reflected light from the sun. But with trees, the very top of the tree is going to be lighter because of the direct sunlight, obviously, but also the atmospheric perspective. And just optically, it helps soften everything to have the trees, the tops of the trees, blend more seamlessly into the sky like that. And it's especially true with distant trees. But that's the same concept, effectively. It's like if you're painting a tree, the trunk of the tree would have sharper lines, and then if you go up into the boughs of the tree, it's going to be more diffuse and looser brushwork. So likewise, you would have sharper lines on the leading legs of the horse and softer lines on the haunches and the back portion of the horse. And then, of course, the helmet of the rider needs to be very stark and sharply defined. And if you're learning to paint and you're struggling with painting ellipses and circular shapes and worrying about the accuracy of your proportions and things like that, it just takes time and practice. And don't get frustrated. Just accept that it's going to be difficult when you're starting out, and it's difficult for everyone. because for a long time I struggled with trying to paint circles, and I would make grids, and I would try to make a square and then square the circle, and even went into trying to use like a compass and all that sort of thing. And the more you try, the harder it is. And it's like in Zen Buddhism, I forget the term, I think it's called O something, but it's where you just make a circle. It's like a perfect circle, and that's supposed to be a sign of mastery of the Zen, is to be able to be in the flow state and just paint that perfect circle. And I don't know how much of it is that I've been painting long enough to have developed the motor skills necessary, and how much of it is that I'm just getting older and I don't care as much. But whatever the case may be, I find that it's easier for me to do circles now. I don't even really think about it. It's just, and it's important in painting, as in a lot of things, to move not from the wrist or the fingers, but with the whole range of motion with your arm. You even put your back into it when you're painting circles and things like that. Especially, the more fluid you can move, and counterintuitively, moving with your entire arm and your entire body, you have much more control than if you try to use a small handled brush and get really close in and tightly detailed. Like Claude Monet, when he got older, he was painting with brushes that were several feet long on these giant canvases, and it helped him because he had a trimmer, and he was able to stay steady with those longer handled brushes. And that's why you'll often see like that I use these long handled brushes, and I hold them near the back of the brush, and I always paint standing. I never sit down. I'm always standing, so I can step away and I can get a lot of that full range of motion into the mark making. And that's the way I painted for most of my career. And it's only in the past year or so that I finally begun working with short-handled brushes for portraits. And I still have yet to purchase a maul stick, but I will sometimes hold the brushes against the canvas and balance my wrist against them if I'm trying to do something very meticulous. But I don't think that any of that is necessary, especially in these days of AI image generation, when any photorealistic image can be generated quickly, and photography is cheap and printing is cheap. That's not the goal that artists should be trying to achieve. I saw a painting recently where someone was painting each, I guess they're called quills of a feather. I don't know what you call the individual parts of a feather, but they were painting an owl with a tiny little brush and going in and painting each one of the little things on the feathers. And I was just, that boggles my mind. I don't think that that's a good use of time, but that's another part of aging, is that I'm recognizing the value of time, and maybe that's kind of what this painting represents with the horse. We're racing to the finish, and we are quickly approaching the finish of this video. But I think I will increase the time-lapse speed, and we will get through, because right now we're at about 48 minutes, so give me just a moment. I decided to speed the video up from 3 times to 5 times, so we're now cooking with gas, and this should keep everything under an hour. And I'm using that same gray mixture that I used before on the horse to give more form to the jacket of the rider while keeping it dark. And for the collar of the rider and the whites of the pants and the white of the saddle, I used cadmium red with titanium white to get the brightest of those highlights. But everywhere else, on the jacket, on the helmet, on the horse, I used Naples yellow, which is a very versatile and useful yellow to use for a highlight when you mix Naples yellow and titanium white. And Naples yellow is also opaque, which helps to build up that extra brightness. And you can see here that I'm just indicating the forms of the grass, especially in the foreground. It's important to have a lot of texture and a lot of depth to the colors. I'm using a lot of really saturated greens, which can be mixed from sap green, yellow ochre, or pre-made greens like that permanent green light that I mentioned earlier. I used it a lot in this painting. And as you recede into the distance, you want to tone it down more with one of the earth tones. And I was recently looking at one of Andrew Wyeth's paintings where he meticulously painted each blade of grass or each part of this wheat field. And, it looks great, but he must not have had ADD or must have just been a very patient person. This is almost like real time for me, the 5 times speed. I don't enjoy painting, indicating actual grass like that. So a lot of times I just take shortcuts, and I think that's just sort of a personal preference thing, that if you have the patience or if you enjoy painting more than I do, then you can go in and actually paint each one of the blades of grass. But for me, I don't enjoy painting. I enjoy conceptualizing paintings. I enjoy designing paintings, but the actual process of painting itself I don't particularly enjoy. I like working on like an iPad, which is what David Hockney has been doing for the past 20 years or so. If I had a market for such things, I would prefer to do all of my work digitally. And if that's something that you're into and you have a market for it, I would say that there's absolutely no fault in digital work as opposed to traditional painting. But there are some shortcomings. For me, it's easier to paint than it is to work digitally, as far as really getting natural looking color transitions and texture. And I think that will continue to be improved as technology progresses, but for now it's much simpler. And it's a budgetary thing too. If you buy the latest and greatest Surface tablets that are all touch screen and they have like an actual palette built into them, then I think that could certainly be analogous to working with traditional oil painting. But for me, using the sort of rudimentary digital apparatus that I have, it's still easier to paint on a physical thing. And just like I said, the physical movements of putting the entire body into a painting and like moving from the elbow, from the shoulder, you can't really do that with digital painting unless you have a really large screen or some sort of stylus that's made like a pen or like a paintbrush. And here you can see that I'm breaking the rule that I mentioned earlier, and I did actually put some detail into the steeplechase jump thing there in the background, which is not necessary, but I think at this point of the painting I was sort of ahead of schedule, and I thought I would take my time and throw in some bells and whistles, which sometimes sell paintings and sometimes they distract, but it's very much a matter of taste and personal choice. And that particular gate there behind the horse's head does serve some function, because it kind of draws the eye back towards the rider, and it's almost like an arrow shape or a letter E backwards, that the whatever that's called, the beam at the terminus of that jump serves as an eye stopper, I think is what they call them in painting, where it's stopping the eye from moving off the side of the composition and drawing it back towards the rider. And it is a very bright white, which could be distracting, but I tried to use a lot of gray and tone it down more and not have the brightest whites there. And it's also contextual or relative, so the white of the gate is not as bright because it's contrasted with that light green of the grass there, which is almost a white itself, and then the blue of the sky. but the white of the horse's, or the saddle and the rider's leg, that's contrasted with those darkest shades that are on the horse, and the black of the boots. So you get more dynamism there, more contrast, and that's what determines the impact of a color or of a tone. But generally speaking, if you are putting, a stark white object, whether that be a cloud or whether that be a gate like that, you'll want to have it more gray than it actually is in the photograph, just for the sake of composition. And that's where painting differs from photorealism, or from trying to create a facsimile of an image. If you try to copy a photo exactly as it is, it's not going to be as effective a painting as if you take some liberties with it and choose to emphasize certain areas. Like the hand of the rider is very important, because it draws the eye down to the reins, and there to the horse's head and the horse's eye, and then back up to the rider and so forth. So it's important to take some time in adding detail to things like that, which you can see I'm doing here. And when you get to this stage of a painting, that's what you want to do, is just to reiterate the importance of the subject and of the focal point, which means going in and adding more darks, going in and adding more lights, and ensuring that that's the area of the most concentrated interest, the most dynamic color range, and the most actual detail. When that's, sometimes it's like painting the actual courses of rope on the bridle, and the highlights on the bit, and things like that. And in some ways, I think painting horses, and especially equestrian paintings with a horse and a rider, is a very easy thing to paint, because it's made almost for painting composition, because you have all of that gear around the head of the horse, and then the rider, of course, wearing a black helmet against a blue sky is it lends itself to painting, is a very easy subject to choose, and that's something I would recommend. When you're learning to paint. Horses are difficult to paint, as I was mentioning, unless you have a lot of knowledge of horse anatomy, and even then I'm sure it's not terribly easy. It's like painting a person with the added complication of an extra set of legs, but it can be a very rewarding thing to paint. And if you like animals, dogs and cats, those can also be good subjects. But horses in particular, I think, or nude people, because you're seeing the muscles of the animal, and it helps to understand the anatomy more than like with a cat or a dog, where you've got fur over everything. But like I was saying, also with horse paintings, is you have all of the accoutrement, the saddle, and all of the bells and things on the horse, which just gives more to paint, and it makes the painting more effective, because all of that detail is concentrated in the area that you want the eye to focus in. And horse riding tends to take place in open fields, so you've got a good backdrop without much distraction. So I think it's an ideal subject for someone learning to paint, as opposed to something like complicated like a cityscape, where you're having to parse out all of this crazy information and know what to include and what to exclude. With a painting like this of a horse and rider, there's not a lot of intellectual work that goes into it. You're just kind of copying what you see with a few minor changes, like I was saying with the some of the color choices and things like that. And then I'm just sort of adding more highlights to the clouds, and you can put as much or as little time into things like that as you want. And as we're approaching the end of another video, I would like to again thank you for joining me, and please consider subscribing to my newsletter. I try to send one out once a month. Very seldom, if ever, have I sent one out twice a month. It's always usually at the end of the month, just to sort of recap what I've been doing, and if I have any new work available, any sales going on, and occasional giveaways and that sort of thing, and updates about this YouTube channel, updates about my website itself, updates about my blog. And I am trying to continue to output some art information on my blog. I've been mostly just complaining about the internet lately, and I'm going to try to return to actual art subjects and maybe discuss things about pigment colors and things that would be actually useful to people. So if you've enjoyed this, and if you are a painter, or if you're simply an art enjoyer, I would greatly appreciate your joining my newsletter. And with that, we're just finishing up the boots, and I signed it, I think, after I stopped the video. So thank you for watching.